Greetings. Dr. Frank here. Thank you for listening today. Those of you following my work over the years know that my motto is follow the data. This mindset is an extension of my scientific discipline, but it's become paramount during this era of ideological subversion, a la Bezmenov, where facts are obscured by propaganda and the public is so demoralized that even when you show authentic proof on a subject, the people will still refuse to believe it. They will say that something white is black, that a human being in the womb is not a person, and that a person with a penis is a female. And they will actually believe these things. It is shockingly Orwellian. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. This brainwashing is especially evident in the climate change discussion, which is why, since 1981, I have made a practice of downloading and studying climate data. I want my opinions and decisions to be based upon actual data, not propaganda. For decades, I've been visiting Dr. Roy Spencer's webpage to download his global atmospheric temperature data and graphs. I've often reposted those graphs on social media with a short explanation in a meager attempt to counter the public brainwashing. The purpose of this presentation is to explain more of the details and to provide a reference that I can send people to in the future as I post the monthly updates. Dr. Spencer has done an amazing service for those of us who care about the truth. He has been updating and graphing the entire satellite record of global atmospheric temperatures since we first put up the satellites up in orbit in 1979. These data are particularly important to the discussion because they provide evenly distributed global temperature averages, not only for the entire planet, but also for various portions of the atmosphere. Land-based measurements were suffering from multiple issues, but most notably an uneven distribution of temperature sensors and the urban heat island effect. Because of this effect, inflated rising temperatures were being reported during the last century due to encroachment by human interferences. Temperature sensors, once surrounded by fields and forests, are now located near hot concrete buildings and asphalt roads. Because the urban heat island effect adversely affected so many of our land-based measurements during the last century, the public has been misled into thinking that global temperatures were increasing at an accelerating rate. Once it was finally established in 2022 that thousands of our land-based temperature stations were reporting inflated atmospheric temperatures, the NOAA began compiling a new temperature record based upon the mere 114 stations that meet current NOAA standards. The land-based data before 2005 are fatally flawed. So NOAA's new monthly updated graph begins in 2005, and it shows no discernible warming trend in the contiguous United States since 2005. So what do the satellite data show? Here is Dr. Spencer's most recent updated graph of the entire satellite record for the lower atmosphere. Note that the dates on the graph start when we first placed the satellites up in orbit in 1979, and they end with the month of November 2024. The vertical axis of Dr. Spencer's graph shows the monthly departure in degrees centigrade from the global average temperature spanning 1991 to 2020. The graph displays monthly averages as blue dots, and the smooth red line is a 13-month running average, essentially a yearly average. To me, the most startling thing about these data is how little the average global temperature has changed over 45 years. In fact, the average global temperature is currently only increasing at a rate of 1.6 degrees centigrade every century. To illustrate this, I've reproduced Dr. Spencer's graph and added a linear regression to the data. Before I address the cyclical pattern and the steady temperature rise, it is important to recognize how small the actual variations are and to marvel at the feedback mechanisms which moderate the Earth's average temperature. Today, the high temperature in my Ohio town was 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and tonight the low will be 16 degrees Fahrenheit. corresponding to a change of 16 degrees centigrade. Yep, it's winter in Ohio. Thus, the temperature swing in my town just today is about 10 times larger than the total range of the data shown in the graph. To illustrate the relative values, I've first zoomed out to a larger scale and then superimposed today's temperature variation in my Ohio town. For reference, I've also shown the average winter low and summer high temperatures for my region so that you can see that the daily and seasonal swings in temperature are about 100 times larger than the variations in the monthly graph. I have also projected the linear trend for a century so that you can appreciate how small even the projected change is compared with our environment's natural variation. How is the Earth able to maintain its average temperature so well? The answer is because there are so many natural feedback mechanisms which regulate it. To understand feedback, let's briefly review the structure of our atmosphere. There are several regions in our atmosphere, starting with the troposphere, where we live, and extending to the exosphere. The mountains reach about 2/3 into the troposphere from the surface of the Earth. Our plains typically fly in the upper troposphere. The clouds form in the troposphere. Our satellites orbit in the thermosphere. And the shooting stars we see are typically burning up in the mesosphere. You've probably heard the term greenhouse effect before. Here's how it works. When light from the sun reaches our atmosphere, some of it is absorbed and some is reflected, but about half of it reaches the surface of the Earth, where much of it is absorbed, warming the surface. The warm surface of the Earth then emits infrared light, which is readily absorbed by molecules in the atmosphere, which are called greenhouse gases, because they are essentially trapping the emitted infrared light in our atmosphere by absorbing it. The atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, which both transmit visible light, but screen out much of the harmful UV light, which is integral to the process of forming our ozone layer. The remaining 1% of atmospheric gases is mostly water vapor, with trace amounts of other gases. Water vapor is by far the most significant greenhouse gas. A similar phenomenon takes place with greenhouses, which is why we call this atmospheric process the greenhouse effect. The glass windows of a greenhouse allow visible light to pass through, but not the infrared. So when the transmitted visible light is absorbed by the interior of the greenhouse, the inside of the greenhouse warms because the emitted infrared light is then trapped inside by the glass. Thus, the atmosphere surrounding our planet behaves like the glass in a greenhouse, allowing the higher energy visible light to pass through and warm the surface, but then trapping the lower energy emitted light in the atmosphere by absorbing it. It is important to note that none of the emitted infrared light makes it through the troposphere because there are so many molecules in the atmosphere that can absorb it, especially water vapor. The satellite data I've been showing you from Dr. Spencer's website is the global average temperature for the troposphere, precisely where any increased warming from a global greenhouse effect would be expected to occur. But the greenhouse effect also provides a feedback mechanism which regulates the Earth temperature. For example, if the average global temperature increases, then more water will evaporate. So more clouds will form, which then reflect more sunlight back into space, called cloud albedo. So then the planet cools down. Then, as the atmosphere cools, the water vapor it contains condenses and precipitates, clearing the atmosphere so the process can repeat. Of course, as the Earth rotates, a different portion is always bathing in sunlight, so there are always warming and cooling portions. This is the mechanism that produces the water cycle and the primary feedback which allows the temperature of the planet to be tightly regulated. It's good for humans that there are so many feedback mechanisms because there are so many things that naturally vary and perturb our environment. The sun's emission itself varies. There are ocean temperature cycles like El Nino and volcanic eruptions that add gases and particulates to the atmosphere, which also affect the heat flow dynamics. And now that we've reviewed their meaning and context, let's return to the satellite data and do some modeling. We started with the monthly global troposphere temperatures based upon Dr. Spencer's satellite data. Then we smoothed the data with a 13-month filter and found the slow, linearly increasing temperature trend in the data. If we then remove that linear trend and show just the smooth data, we can model the smooth data with a periodic function. The best fit function had a period of 3.66 years with a peak-to-peak amplitude of 0.24 degrees centigrade. This variation is about 65 times smaller than the temperature swing in my town today. Now, if we combine the linear trend and the periodic function, and then superimpose them back onto the satellite data, we now have a simple model that gives us a deeper understanding of the data and allows us to make short and long-term predictions that are based upon the data. For example, based upon this simple model, we would expect temperatures to begin dropping from where they have been throughout 2024. And sure enough, the latest data point is falling. And even though the temperatures in 2024 were some of the highest in the satellite record, based upon the data and our simple model, we can expect global temperatures to be cooler for the next several years, in the neighborhood of 0.6 degrees centigrade cooler than the average in 2024. That's about 1 degree Fahrenheit. But I don't expect to hear this in the media headlines. Instead, it'll be something more like, satellite measurements of the atmosphere reveal that 2024 was the hottest year during the modern era. If governments don't take immediate action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, scientists warn of increasing natural disasters due to climate change. Of course, this sort of statement may be factual, but it doesn't convey the larger context. And just because some scientist says it, it doesn't mean it's a scientifically valid statement. After I wrote this part, I looked it up, and sure enough, here is the official temperature record promoted by the climate change community. Note that 2024 is on track to be the warmest year, and the reference to the pre-industrial era, implying that humans are causing the warming. Note also that they are clearly not using the satellite data, because their slope is 2.4 degrees centigrade per century, versus the satellite value of 1.6 degrees C per century. Their slope is 50% higher than the satellite data. Furthermore, their temperature trend is in stark contrast to the new NOAA record, which tracks the 114 properly placed temperature sensors. So, why isn't the climate change community using the satellite data nor the corrected land-based data? Obviously, because the new land-based data show no statistically discernible change, and an objective scientific presentation does not support their dire messaging. In the early 90s, the chairman of the Cambridge University Chemistry Department visited my laboratory to collaborate on a scientific paper that later appeared in Nature. I was shocked to learn during his visit that he was also traveling the world, stating widely and publicly that climate change was the most severe problem facing the world, even more serious than the threat of terrorism, and that by the end of the century, the only remaining habitable place on the planet would be Antarctica. Not long after, this scientist was knighted and elected to the Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Royal Society. Obviously, he wasn't following the satellite data, or he himself was brainwashed, or he was simply using scare tactics and propaganda to advance his political ambitions. Maybe all three. Clearly, scientists are rewarded for towing the party line. Regardless, because I had been following the data, I was not too concerned. Certainly, the public couldn't really be that gullible. Sadly, I was wrong. The climate change messaging has been a very effective bludgeon in the hands of our politicians, leveraging it for all sorts of non-scientific agendas, which is why I want to immunize you from such tactics by learning to follow the data. For example, when I followed the data regarding the threat to our polar bears, I discovered that their populations have quadrupled since they became a poster child for environmental catastrophe. But regarding the climate, I rarely hear the discussion, what might be good about increasing atmospheric CO2 or increasing average global temperature? Ironically, in the 1990s, a group of 60 Canadian scientists endorsed the letter to their government, encouraging it to support policies which increase global warming. In other words, it would be better for Canadians to have longer growing seasons and warmer, shorter cold seasons. People need to realize that CO2 is plant food, that warmer climates with more CO2 increase global food production, that people thrive less during colder weather, and that on geological timescales, our planet is actually far colder and CO2 deprived at present than it has ever been. Humans thrive better in warmer, not colder climes. A team of European scientists actually researched what would be the best temperature for human thriving, and their answer was about 2 degrees centigrade warmer than today. So at the current rate, things should be getting better for humans for at least the next couple of hundred years. And since the trend in temperature change is so small and steady, there would be ample time for humans to adapt to any potential negative consequences along the way. Actually, I'm more concerned about our increasingly tyrannical governments than I am of any natural phenomenon. Their use of the climate change boogeyman to infringe upon our liberty is a far more ominous threat to the health and well-being of my children and grandchildren over the next 100 years than some small, gradual increase in global temperature that's likely to improve human thriving, and which we have little control over anyway. It's arrogant to think that we piddly humans can overwhelm nature's feedbacks when she regularly handles emissions from 3,000 volcanic eruptions each year in the short term and Milankovitch orbital cycles in the long term. Which raises the question, what about the steady increase in temperature of 1.6 degrees C per century that we observe in the satellite data? Could it be human-caused? The term is anthropogenic. I've already said that I don't think that warming is a bad thing, but I also don't think it's anthropogenic because I've been following the data. The claim is that global temperatures recently began to increase because humans have increased the atmospheric CO2 during the industrial era. And sure enough, the temperature data have shown an increasing trend throughout the Industrial Revolution. Although, remember, these land-based measurements are likely exaggerated due to the urban heat island effect, as I described earlier. So let's look at the data in a longer historical context. The problem here is, how do we know what the temperatures were hundreds of thousands of years ago? We didn't have satellites, nor reliable, well-distributed thermometers. The answer is, geologists reconstruct the temperature record using proxies. They examine tree rings, ice cores, sedimentary layers, measuring air bubbles and various physical and chemical properties that can be correlated to temperature based upon a set of assumptions. This graph shows just such a reconstruction from 0 to 2000 AD. The annual estimates exhibit a lot of variability, just like we've seen in the modern satellite data. In other words, the variability is not noise. The dotted lines show the 95% confidence intervals for each of the annual estimates. Some proxies are resolved on longer timescales, and they align well with the annual estimates, as can be seen in the low-frequency component of the reconstruction. The graph is color-coded so that orange indicates periods of time where there was prolonged warming, like the medieval warming period, and blue where there were prolonged periods of cooling, including what geologists have termed the Little Ice Age. Did humans cause these changes? Of course not. These reflect nature's longer-term variations and regulatory mechanisms in action. It is important to note that the proxies used in this reconstruction indicate that it was actually warmer during the medieval warming period than it is today. The relatively sharp rise in temperature observed since the Little Ice Age is difficult to quantify because of the natural variability in the data. It depends when and how you measure it. It ranges anywhere from a quarter to over 1 degree centigrade per century. Ironically, back in the 1970s, when the average temperature started dropping, climate scientists announced the onset of the next ice age, complete with ominous signs of dramatic global changes, drops in food output, and political instability. The same alarmism, but this time in the opposite direction, was deployed 30 years later when modern temperature measurements were spliced onto the proxy reconstructions. Of course, it isn't fair to merge these two sets of data, since the modern proxies don't show the dramatic increase seen in the newer measurements. Because the two types of measurements don't agree, I suspect that the historical proxies probably underestimate the historic temperatures. Notice that this graph did not include the current proxy values. It's far scarier to present the data in this way, often referred to as the hockey stick graph, now rejected by the scientific community. Regardless, historical trends show temperature variations analogous to modern ones, and more importantly, that the planet was already in warming mode before the modern industrial age. Thus, we can't be sure yet whether humans are actually affecting the global temperature. The natural variations in the data are simply too high. A rigorous examination of these statistics has concluded that we will need about 200 more years of climate data before we could even be 50% certain that humans are having any effect at all. In other words, even after we've gathered 200 more years of data, it will still only be a coin flip whether humans have made any discernible difference. So, according to the data and the statistics, the jury is still out on whether humans have had or even could have a significant effect on the average global temperature. Nevertheless, people with political agendas are making dramatic claims and dire predictions. They are engaged in a category of science known since Irving Langmuir as pathological science. Pathological science occurs when personal biases, political agendas, or funding considerations defeat objectivity and affect conclusions derived from highly variable data, typically near the edge of detectability. For example, during a 1990s grant writing course, I learned that one doubles the chances of having a research grant funded if the words climate change appear in the abstract. And now, because of the desire for research funds, the entire climate science community has been thoroughly infected with this malady. The objective of the climate change community is not to explore and report the facts about our climate, but rather to receive funding by empowering the political establishment with an arsenal of existential threats. This explains why so little attention is given to discussing the best, most objective data from our satellites, and so much emphasis is placed on the artificially inflated, land-based measurements. The media also benefits from this situation by amplifying and marketing the hyper-existential messaging. Obviously, Gore's prediction that the polar ice cap would be melted by 2014 did not pan out. What about the other temperature predictions promoted by the climate change community? This graph collects dozens of such model predictions, and I've highlighted their average in red. The green circles and blue squares represent yet another series of atmospheric temperature data that we can use to compare, gathered in the troposphere by weather balloons. Clearly, the weather balloons are not finding temperatures to be as warm as the climate models are predicting. We can also compare the model predictions with the satellite data by taking the average of the climate models from this graph and superimposing it onto the satellite data. Clearly, the climate models are predicting a much larger warming rate than that observed in the satellite data. The models predict a warming trend of 3.7 degrees C per century, more than double the observed satellite rate. The predicted rates are even faster than the inflated land-based temperature record. Climate change models are failing because they are trying to correlate the amount of warming with the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and these simply don't correlate. I could show you several long-term temperature reconstructions which show this, but let's save that for another day. They want us to think that if we increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, that warming will result. But when one looks closely into the matter, this claim does not make sense. First of all, CO2 is plant food, and if there is more of it in the air, then our plants and trees are going to feast on it. That's one reason it's so invigorating to go for a walk in the forest, because the trees are scarfing the CO2 in the air and producing all sorts of lovely oxygen for you to enjoy. If you measure the CO2 in the air in the middle of a cornfield, you'll find it to be very low. The plants are actually starving for it. And the more CO2 there is in the air, the faster they'll suck it up. Confirming this, recent surveys performed by NASA have shown that the entire planet is greening in response to the relatively small, recent increase in CO2 levels. On geological timescales, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is at historic lows, and plants are essentially starving for it. Second of all, although CO2 certainly does absorb infrared light, making it a greenhouse gas, its effect is minor compared to the role played by water. Here are the concentrations for the 4 strongest greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. Water vapor is first, and its concentration varies based upon temperature and geography. The humidity is highest in the tropics and lowest at the poles. The poles stay cold, not just because they receive less sunlight, but also because since it's cooler, there is less water in the air to trap any emitted IR, and there is less IR because glaciers and snow cover reflects much of the incident radiation rather than absorbing it, so that it can be re-emitted as infrared light. From 1960 to present, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 at Mauna Loa Station has increased from 320 to 420 ppm, and the typical water vapor concentration there is about 30,000 ppm. Thus, in 1960, water molecules outnumbered CO2 molecules by about 90 to 1. Today, water molecules outnumber CO2 molecules 70-fold. But remember, there's already so much absorption of IR by the atmosphere that none of the emitted IR at the surface makes it through the atmosphere anyway. All of the heat is already trapped. Adding a tiny bit more of CO2 is not going to affect that. And even if it did, it would be easily compensated for by the water cycle feedback. The CO2 can't win the race. If it does cause warming, more water evaporates, easily outpacing it and compensating. Because the observed CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is increasing so smoothly, it is more likely due to outgassing of the ocean than any human activity, because the ocean temperature has also been slightly warming over time, right along with the atmosphere. Just like a carbonated drink loses its fizz faster when it's warmer. Climate scientists readily admit that the direct effect of CO2 is minor. So the discussion instead migrates to tipping points and other difficult to quantify topics like sea level rise, ocean acidification, atmospheric rivers, and severe weather. There are a wide variety of these pathological claims based upon anecdotal data and where the model predictions don't match the observations, such as the temperature data discussed here. My objective in assembling this presentation was to demonstrate how following the climate data can help you to cut through the propaganda and get you to the truth so that you can form rational opinions on important issues. With the media in cahoots with corrupt political and global interests, following the data and then widely disseminating it is the critical antidote to inoculating the public against government overreach and tyranny. Before I wrap up, let's briefly review the data that I've presented. I've shown you satellite measurements of the troposphere temperature from 1979 to present. That's the entire satellite record. I've shown you a temperature reconstruction using proxies starting from 0 AD to present. I've shown you land-based temperature measurements from 1850 to present, uncorrected for the urban heat island effect. Land-based temperature measurements from 2005 to present, based upon the 114 NOAA approved locations, the corrected land-based data. I've shown you weather balloon atmospheric temperature measurements from 1978 to 2011. A 2,000-year temperature reconstruction with modern temperature measurements spliced onto it, the so-called hockey stick graph. A 65 million year reconstruction using oxygen isotope proxy data to show you the long-term geological temperatures. And finally, I showed you the composition of our atmosphere, including a 60-year plot of CO2 concentrations near Mauna Loa, Hawaii. Those are a lot of data to follow, even for me, and I love doing it, which is why I like to focus my attention on the best, most objective set of data that we have on the subject. The satellite temperature data reported monthly on Dr. Spencer's website. He usually has an update the first few days of each month showing an updated graph of the entire satellite record, and I plan to continue forwarding his updates on my social media sites. Finally, here are my takeaway talking points from this talk. 1. The most accurate record we have of global temperature trends is based upon measurements being acquired from satellites we placed in orbit in 1979. Dr. Spencer has been posting monthly updates of these satellite data so that we can accurately track the global atmospheric temperature trends. Thank you, Dr. Spencer. The satellite data show annual and cyclical variations combined with a slow, linear increase in atmospheric temperature at a rate of about 1.6 degrees C per century. There are several feedback mechanisms that naturally regulate the temperature of the global atmosphere, including the greenhouse effect and, of course, the water cycle. A 2-millennium temperature record reconstructed from proxies suggested that the planet was already in warming mode prior to the modern era, recovering from an extended cold period known as the Little Ice Age. The natural variability in the data is so large that it will require another 200 years of observations in order for us to be 50% certain if any portion of the recently observed temperature increase is anthropogenic. Those promoting the climate change agenda are making exaggerated claims. The climate science community is permeated with pathological science. The media is hyping the issue as existential, and the public is generally unaware of the actual evidence, making climate change a political issue instead of a scientific one. In the absence of any significant evidence of warming in the precise portion of the atmosphere where greenhouse models have predicted it, we conclude that any drastic measures are not warranted at the present time. So the most responsible course of action at this time is to continue carefully monitoring the situation, to call out those who misrepresent the evidence, and to continue following the data. I look forward to connecting with you all out there, following the data together. See you then.